Good morning, and thank you for standing by. I would like to let all participants know you're on a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's conference. If you have a question, you can press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. Today's call is also being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'll now turn the call over to Peter Silva. Sir, you may begin.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. And so we're going to present Drive Identity into your network. It'll probably be about a maybe give or take 20 minutes to a half-hour presentation, and then we always like to open it up for a number of questions to get feedback and answer anything that comes up during the presentation. So why don't we get into it? I also want to add that we have Jonathan George, who's our product marketing manager, and Andy Oler, who is the product manager for our access products on the line. So if you imagine the flow of anything, be it people, cars, water, electricity, commerce, there are specific points within those flows that provide intelligent processing and control. Typically, these control points exist at strategic points within the flow. So you can see we got users up top and resources down the bottom. And these are discrete boundaries or junctures where these multiple flows coalesce for redistribution. Their purpose is to provide critical flow control, redirection, intelligent management, and security functionality. Now, the control mechanism might be simple, like a stop sign between two roads, or it might be complex, like a power distribution or control systems within a modern high-rise building. It might be physical, virtual, or procedural, but regardless of form, without such a control point, the efficient, safe, and uninterrupted flow of any system would be impossible. So you can see we got the things moving around, all that. Now, at the same time, the origination and destination of traffic rarely stays the same over time. And you remember the people moving around, and potentially your resources are moving around. They might be in the cloud. They might be in multiple data centers. And so as the flows change, the strategic points of control often cannot adapt dynamically and thus become impediments to an efficient flow. And so if you think about a stop sign on a two-lane road, that works great because it stops the one car, allows another car to go, and then back and forth. But if you put that same stop sign on a four-lane highway, well, it's going to impede traffic. It might create safety situations with people crashing into each other. And so often the process of changing the type of function of a control to meet the new demands, can be long, complicated, and costly. Having to uninstall that one stop sign and put in, a different form of mechanism on the highway. But within all that, all of these intelligent decisions need to be made to ensure that, in this specific case, users are getting to their resources. And we circled security in this particular slide because that's a critical part of this particular dynamic control point and a strategic point of control. And today, obviously, IT faces a variety of changes that require control points that can adapt dynamically. So, oftentimes you might be going to one data center and you move around the country or around the world, and potentially the resources move around the world or to a different data center. And so that strategic point of control needs to be intelligent enough to know where to send that information. Now, part of all that is obviously your digital identity. I often talk there's a difference between, your image versus your identity. And movie stars, rock stars, those sort of people, might be a perfect example in that they create these images or these personas for the public. That's what sells. And then, that might not be their true identity, who they are, what their greatest fears are, and those sorts of things. And so your digital identity is critically important in determining then what you are authorized to see. And, of course, all of these, your identity, what you say, what you know, who you are. With authentication, oftentimes it's what you know, who you are, and a number of other, what you have, a number of other pieces of information. And if you think about your identity, too, and any of the websites that are out there now, of course, you need to authenticate and have the proper identity to get into your financial banking systems or those sensitive pieces of information. But if you go to any portal these days, whether it's your My Yahoo or your personalized Google or any of those, you still have to enter some sort of piece of information, your identity, usually it's a username and password, to then get your specific content that is particular to you. And so all of this makes it very important. Now, there's also this thing out there called anonymous networks. And anonymous networks allow users to gain access to systems via a simple username and password, but those anonymous networks cannot decipher exactly who the user is, whether they're an employee, a guest, a contractor, a partner, or anything else. Now, anonymous networks do have visibility at the IP or MAC address level, but that information does not really equate to a user's identity. So, you could be connected to a particular resource, but of course somebody else can hit that same computer, say it's a shared desktop or something, and enter their own username and credentials to get to certain resources. Now, the autonomous network just knows that IP address, but can't determine whether it's employee A or employee B. And so since these networks are unable to attribute IP to identity, the risk is that information may be available to users who are not authorized to see it. And that's, of course, something we don't want to have happen. There's also no reporting as to what was accessed or where a specific user has navigated within the system. Imagine a partner traveling in through the contractors area and getting information about contractors. And so controlling and managing access to system resources must be based on identity. A user's identity, whether it's expressed or digitally represented, can include those particular identifiers that we showed, in the last screen. And, in the real world, in the physical world, it's easy to prove you are who you say you are, because oftentimes, can I see your driver's license? So you pull out the driver's license, they look at the picture, they look at your face. Oh, okay, I have verified you. But in the digital world, that's much more difficult, right? Because, it might be a token, it might be a username and password, but there's really no, physicalness to it. It's all digital. And so it's critically important. It's critically important to us as users to ensure that nobody else gets into our own personalized, banking information. But, of course, it's also critical to businesses to ensure that only those authorized users see their specific resources. And so things like, sensitive user access needs to be controlled. So who's behind door number 3? Unauthorized access to systems is a huge concern for companies, not only pertaining to the disclosure and loss of confidential company data, but then, of course, the potential risks to regulatory compliance. And we've seen, the stories over the last couple of months of numbers of these companies getting breached and having, these outside individuals gain access to this information. It's just, we've been reading, and it's pretty bad now. And so it's business critical that only authenticated users gain admission and that they only access the resources they are authorized to see. And thus, manage access based on identity. You obviously want to control the access of the endpoints, since various users, if you remember the users moving around, they also may be swapping out devices or using different devices depending upon where they are. A lot of companies are going through consolidation. A lot of companies are also deploying hosted virtual desktops. And then one of the things that we've obviously noticed real recently is that there are a lot of companies that are doing Microsoft Exchange migrations or, email migrations, and the challenges that they're facing with that. And so there are a number of ways to authenticate web users today. Now, some organizations will code authentication right into the application during development. Others install agents on the servers, and many others actually have specialized access proxies to authenticate the user. Now, all these deployments are pretty difficult to manage and difficult to change, and they don't really interoperate well. And they can cost a lot also in management since it's decentralized and potentially every single server will need attention. And it's also costly and may not be as secure or scalable for a global workforce. In those situations, too, the AAA, the authentication, authorization, and accounting, when it comes to, that particular piece of checking identity, the authorization and accounting piece that might be required for regulatory compliance, those can be overlooked or completely missing with those three other deployment strategies that I mentioned. And so, adding the F5 Big IP Access Policy Manager, or the APM, as many of you might be familiar with, to the Big IP Local Traffic Manager, or even the Big IP LTM Virtual Edition, if you've deployed the VE in a cloud deployment, this brings identity, authentication, and access control to any Big IP environment, giving IT the ability to consolidate the global infrastructure, reduce AAA management costs, and drive user identity into the network. And so in this situation, there may be situations where you want to provide authentication and client validation prior to giving access to unsecured applications. And so you can see here in the picture that this is a public website. That's actually our public website, F5's. And you might allow just any user access to particular pieces of information, case studies, maybe data sheets, application guides. But there might be a specific location, whether it's the technology center or solution profiles or performance tools, any one of them, where when they click specifically on that, you do want to have a gate. You do only want to have entitled people to see those pieces of information. And so secure authentication can be added for this purpose. And this authentication method is used first to create a secure session and then give access to the services behind it. And so what does that look like? So they're clicking around and, I want to get to, just for the sake of this slide, case studies. And as soon as they click on that, so any of the other ones that go to the particular location, now if they click case studies, for instance, this particular, and of course it can be customized for your own logos and colors and those sorts of things, will then be presented to the user as a little gate to then ensure that they enter their particular credentials. It goes against the user store. It could be Active Directory. It could be LDAP. It could be Radius. It could be Secure ID. And then based on that identity, they're then allowed to go in and see that specific resource because they are then authorized to see it. It's kind of, the member areas that you might see on certain websites. And so how do you create those things on F5 Big IP Access Policy Manager? It is actually done with our Visual Policy Editor. We introduced this Visual Policy Editor a number of years back with our FirePass SSL VPN product. And back then we had it to do all the pre-logon checks, so endpoint host checks, checking to see if the computer that's requesting access is abiding by a certain security policy. It might be antivirus, might be firewall, it might be the antivirus definitions are up to date. Does it have a particular reg key? Does it have a client certificate? Any of those things. And based on those checks, you either are able to log on or you don't get access. With the Big IP Access Policy Manager, we've expanded the Visual Policy Editor to then allow administrators to not only do all the pre-logon checks, and so on this top one where it says Access Policy New, you can see Windows, AV, and Firewall. And if it is successful then, you can then go in and the IT administrator can actually Radius, which would be the authentication, the user store that the user has to hit, and then assign the resources. And you can see there are various trees to this, success and failure. On any of those failures, if you put your mouse over the little plus sign, you're then able to add a new inspector, a new condition to then determine whether or not they're allowed to gain access to certain resources. And so you can build these various flows within this chart, and then really know exactly what is required, and then which users are getting to which particular resources. So even, for instance, here they fail on the Windows antivirus and firewall, you might add another inspector that will automatically check the system and let the user know what's missing. Oh, you need to update your virus definitions, or even taking that post data, sending it to a remediation server, and then having that remediation server itself send over the updated virus definitions. It'll run through the process again, and then at that point, they're allowed access. They're not denied access to the system. Even with the authentication mechanisms, you can see below the radius is done. Now, maybe you have your employees going through Active Directory. Maybe you have your partners going through Radius, and maybe you have your contractors going through LDAP. You can make additional, so they fail Radius because that's only for, partners. But then you hit the little plus sign, and then you add Active Directory. And so you can start tiering your user stores, your authentication mechanisms within this single GUI. And so if they miss one, hopefully they'll hit the other, and then there'll be another little tree or another little branch that then assigns resources and allows them access to the system. So it's actually really easy, real cool to use, and in fact, a number of our customers, when an auditor comes in and says, oh, so, what are you doing for your remote access users, all your global VPN users, they'll print up this, their flow chart, hand it to the auditor, and it's very detailed, and the auditor says, oh, okay, cool, now we know exactly what you're checking, how they're getting authenticated, and what they're gaining access to. You also obviously have to control the access of the endpoints. Now, we all have these, various devices out there. They're all many times, requesting access. Sometimes there are our own, personal devices that we're asking to then be able to use on the network. And so not only can you check and provide access based on the identity, you can also then provide it based on the device. So there might be devices out there that don't support certain functions, say terminal server or some other application that users need access to, maybe coming from their work corporate issued laptop. Sorry about that, my phone dropped. So they're coming from their corporate-issued laptop. They put in a valid username and password, and they get access to everything. It's the same username, password, the same identity, but they're coming from their home computer. They might get limited resources. Or they're coming from a mobile device that might not support all of the various applications. Well, it'll do that check and then only deliver the types of applications that are compliant or that are supported by that particular device. And if they're non-compliant devices out there, provide the remediation or at least the information to the user. It's not just hey, you're denied, go home. It's, we haven't been able to provide you access, and the reasons are these. If you correct these reasons or change your device or whatever the message is, then they'll be able to see everything that they needed to see. And so understanding who the user is, where the user is accessing the application, what the current network conditions are all done. This is what we call context. It's within the context of the request, and context means, the user, the device, the integrity of the device, both at time of request and during the entire session. Context is very important to then making intelligent decisions. And so I kind of talked a little bit about this already, controlling access to the endpoints. Even deeper is that, and I talked about firewall and access to specific applications. You can also say if it's a non-recognized device or maybe a non-particular, a non-compliant or a different type of device, or it's a user that is outside the certain realm. Maybe employees might be your realm. You can also then put those particular users, you don't necessarily deny access, but you put them into a virtual workspace or a protected workspace. And you can even lock down things like, restricting USB access so they're not able to read-write. Restricting read-write access to the CD-ROM or DVD-ROM so they can't write any of the files to a local piece of media. And then once that session's done, because it's a completely virtual session, it's encrypted, the files are encrypted, once that session is done, everything gets erased. Everything gets purged from that session, and so there's no leftover residue. So if somebody wants to download, they can certainly see on their screen potentially, some financial documents, but they can't take it with them. So it's sort of, part of that data loss prevention program. Wipes it clean, and they don't have access to it once they return as their normal user. Kind of talked a little bit about the consolidation. So if corporations are deploying in the cloud, consolidating their data center, maybe using cloud for bursting, have multiple data centers, with this solution, the other thing is that, a company might have a deployment for their wireless. They might have a deployment for their VPN users. They might have a deployment for their LAN access, the whole, NAC solution. So you can manage both the local and remote users with this solution. You can consolidate your AAA management for multiple applications, and then, of course, scale to tens of thousands of users all over the globe, no matter where they're coming from. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of customers are deploying hosted virtual desktops, and these are things like Citrix or VMware. And it's very easy and simple to secure these with the BIG-IP Access Policy Manager for BIG-IP LTM, and in many cases, it's better than the vendor's own solution. And so the inclusion of the fine-grained access control on the BIG-IP systems, it offers a huge, powerful enhancement to any virtual desktop system. And so you can optimize, secure, and deliver the virtual desktop infrastructure to any user around the globe. And so some of the things, for instance, now is that you can provide critical load balancing of that virtual desktop infrastructure. Maybe a user is on one system, all of a sudden that system is having some issues, or it crashes, or it reaches a critical point in terms of CPU. The BIG-IP LTM can then bring them, gracefully put them onto another server that's performing much better. It can do health monitoring. It can do SSL offloading for any of these VDI deployments, and that obviously means greater system availability and scalability. There also is optimization involved, so network and protocol optimizations to help organizations manage bandwidth efficiently, and in some cases actually reduces bandwidth costs. And so it really opens up the possibility of making all of these decisions based on the user's identity. And again, you see that the BIG-IP is in that strategic point of control with users on one side and resources on the other. With the BIG-IP LTM Virtual Edition, this can also be a 100% virtual remote access solution for these VDI deployments. And so if you have these, say, in a cloud environment, you can actually add the BIG-IP LTM to your hypervisor environment, and so this can easily be added to existing infrastructure. And as the number of users grow and potentially you want to transition from a virtual edition to an actual appliance version, that's pretty simple and real easy to do. So we're now on slide 16, Exchange migrations. Many companies are also in the process of deploying Microsoft Exchange 2010 or migrating from Exchange 07 to Exchange 2010. And of course, updating any system is a challenge, and email is no different. Specific to email, however, there are some challenges that IT and users run into when doing these Exchange migration. So for instance, there may be some users on an old system and some on the new. Users might not be able to access email for a period of time. Users and or administrations might need to change their Outlook client server settings to make sure they're pointed to the proper server. Replies of certain messages may bounce. Of course, the OWA, the Outlook Web Access URL, may change. Calendars might not be available. And even logging onto the domain from a home computer, even over broadband, can be extremely slow. And so these are all these challenges that companies may face when having to do an exchange migration. When you deploy the big IP, the F5's unified access solutions, it actually alleviates many of those issues. It allows the organization to migrate over time. It allows organizations to use the big IP, APM, and LTM to authenticate users in the DMZ so there are no unknown users accessing the system. Organizations can distribute a single URL for access depending upon the user or group, and the big IP access policy manager will then direct the user to their appropriate server for any exchange iteration. It could be OWA, it could be ActiveSync, it could be Outlook Anywhere. So users don't have to worry about changing URLs or changing bookmarks. You just continue to use that same URL, and it would be the intelligence within the big IP devices that then puts them to the appropriate location. The other thing is that after the migration, the F5 Unified Access Solutions can certainly scale to 600 logons per second, up to 60,000 users on a single appliance, so providing that horsepower for a global user base. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the SSL offload and all of that other functionality in that strategic point of control to ensure that the users are getting fast, available, and secure access. And again, here in this diagram, users on one side, resources on the other, and the context taken and the intelligence done right in the middle, in the center. 1.2 billion mobile workers by 2013. So the IDC came out recently with a worldwide mobile worker population forecast for 2009 to 2013. And the mobile workforce is actually expected to increase from 919 million in 2008 to 1.2 billion in 2013. And that particular figure, at least here in the United States, represents anywhere from 29 to 35% of the worldwide workforce and like 50 to 60 million teleworkers. So it's continuing to explode. We're continuing to request access from these various smartphones and devices. It's not just the laptops and the desktops anymore. And a lot of people are out there doing their business, while they're on the road. And so in this instance, with the big IP Edge Gateway, you get secure accelerated remote access. Okay, got it again, users on the left, resources on the right. So the big IP Edge Gateway is, our TMOS-based SSL VPN. 60,000 users handling all different types of remote access requests, wireless, remote, corporate, and so forth. And so what the big IP Edge Gateway adds is not only, it still has the visual policy editor, it still has the secure encrypted tunnels, but this adds the web acceleration and WAN optimization to the bundle. And so you get all of the critical web acceleration of any of the web applications that are being delivered, but also specific TCP optimizations and various algorithms to determine what's the best optimized delivery of this content. And these optimizations can change over time. The key is to be using all of your bandwidth, whatever pipe you have. If you're only using part of your pipe, well, then you're kind of wasting money. And so it also ensures that you're always using, the best available of whatever is in your bandwidth. And if that changes over time, it's dynamic in that the algorithms will also change to ensure that the users are gaining access. There might be a situation where they're downloading a file from any of those data center resources, and there are a lot of users on, and that particular server goes down. It'll still, on this situation too, even in that previous slides a little bit back, can migrate the user seamlessly from one resource to another and continue that file download, and the user won't even notice what's going on. And those users on the left, again, they enter a single URL or a single request for access, and it'll be the intelligence within the devices that determine which data center they go to. Again, for instance, somebody in the UK might type in their URL and 100% of the time they're going to the UK data center, to the closest resources. But remember, the closest data center may not always be the best performing. But unbeknownst to the user, that UK data center is having power issues, or the system is down, or it's in maintenance mode. Just based on the user's location and the type of information they're requesting, it'll be, again, the intelligence in the big IP systems that'll already know that the UK system is having issues and will immediately direct them to another data center or potentially a cloud deployment. And say if they're coming back to the States for whatever reason to gain access to resources, it'll be that optimization piece that ensures that any requests that are made get delivered lickety-split, that acceleration. They don't even notice that they're going over the sea. They may still think, oh, yeah, I'm going to the data center in Chertsey. Other things like, single sign-on and maintaining sessions. So in VDI deployments, oftentimes if you disconnect or your session is dropped, you have to log on again. You have to then navigate to wherever you were working on, and then you can regain work. Say a user is in the corporate office and they're connected to the LAN, and maybe they got to go to a meeting, so they unplug their system from the domain, and then they immediately jump on the wireless. So we can maintain that session. Again, it's a IT administrator setting, but to maintain that session so that they immediately then connect to the wireless, and everything is already maintained within the session, and it brings them exactly, or not exactly, but yeah, I guess exactly, right back to where they were working once they unplugged. It'll also recognize that they're not on the domain anymore. So with the domain, they might not need an encrypted tunnel, but once they unplug from the domain, connect to the wireless, it'll sense that, and the intelligence will know, okay, we can't be sending this clear anymore over the wire. We need to establish an encrypted tunnel so that everything is secure as it travels back and forth over the wireless. So scale support for not most, pretty much all mobile users out there. And now this slide says easily handle unexpected spikes in mobile usage. I talk a lot about things like disaster recovery. And sort of how I like to talk about this slide is that I look at that in sort of three different forms. So there is disaster recovery, where you do need, many users going to a different location. But I do believe these days a lot of companies are not actually running out to Iron Mountain, for instance, grabbing all the tapes, having to run back, rebuild all the servers. Now, there may be some instances. But with cloud and multiple data centers, a lot of companies have already built in redundancy. And so, yes, you might have to recover from a flood in a data center, and that is a disaster recovery, but users are still gaining access to the systems. There's also business continuity, which is slightly different. A lot of folks will use those terms interchangeably. I look at business continuity as, say, there's a snowstorm in Seattle, and maybe 30%, 50% of the workforce is unable to get to the office for whatever reason because of the snow. Now, all of those users, because they're working from home and they're not sick or they're not incapacitated for any reason, they just can't get to the office. But they still can gain access to systems and continue the business running on that day rather than having 50% of your workforce out doing nothing. So I look at that as business continuity. And then the one that I think happens most often is workforce continuity. And that's more like when, say you are sick, you have the flu, or the child is sick and they got to stay home from school and you got to be home with the child, or you break your ankle and you can't drive. And those are these specific situations that potentially occur on a daily basis for various users out there. It's not that they don't want to go in. It's not that they can't go in. Well, I mean, they can't due to various reasons. But it still allows that particular user to gain access to resources and still be productive throughout the day. With a big IP Edge client, and this is just a little a little client that can be installed on the computer. IT can push it down as part of a package or build it in as part of the image. But it's this intelligence that the Edge client can offer to allow you to jump from any location to any other location, taking that context into consideration, wireless, corporate wireless, your mobile data, air card at home or even on the domain, and determine what is the best way to connect this user to the resources. And I kind of mentioned a couple of slides ago, maybe while they're on the domain accessing certain information, it does get sent clear text, although local networks are no longer the safe haven that they used to be. But as soon as they go onto the wireless, then an encrypted tunnel is demanded and created so that everything is encrypted and secure over that tunnel. Maybe they're coming from a kiosk, or maybe they're coming from their home computer. They come from their office computer, and they do get a full layer 3 tunnel to the network and access to the entire network. Coming from the home computer, their access might be with the access control lists dwindled down to a certain subnet. Contractors may be coming in from, they get full access to certain systems from 9 to 5, but after 5 o'clock, they come in at 11 o'clock. That particular resource is no longer available to them. They can still log on, but maybe they only have access to a web-based system where they can enter their time for the day, their hours for the day. And so it automatically starts whenever you boot your computer and does all this in the background without the user having to interact with it whatsoever, even username and password if it's set up that way. And so it provides easy access to applications, seamless VPN, the single sign-on to various back-end systems, and then auto-connect depending upon where you're coming from and all that context. A little testimonial from one of our customers. And we also support, the various mobile devices out there. Oops, I went one too fast. Hey, what happened to I think I got a picture missing in this slide, but that's okay. So, the iPhone, the iPad, Android, the various mobile devices are all supported with the Big IP Edge client. And the client will actually work on the FirePass SSL VPN if you have that, the Big IP Access Policy Manager, and or the Big IP Edge Gateway. So it really doesn't matter what you have deployed on the back-end system. This client will work with all of those products. A number of our customers are going from migrations from the FirePass to the Big IP Edge Gateway, and the client really allows and provides that easy, seamless migration from one system to another, and the users don't necessarily know what system they're gaining access to, but it does allow IT to just deploy that one client and on the back end do what they need to do to upgrade, migrate, change systems, and the client will always be intelligent enough to know which of those systems to gain access to. And of course, the tunnels are fully encrypted and secure. And so are there any questions? Can the operator please open up the line if there are any questions?
Yes, sir. If you do have a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. You will be prompted to record your name. Once again, if you have a question, please press *1. If your question has been asked, you may press *2. One moment, please. Sir, I'm not showing any questions at this time. As a reminder, you can press *1 if you do have a question.
Was there anything I missed, Andy or Jonathan, that you might want to add or make clarifications to? I kind of
Sir, I do have a question now.
Okay.
David Larson, your line is open.
Yeah, my question is about the Edge Gateway client. Does it support dual authentication? So multiple layers of authentication instead of just a single auth? Because from playing with it, it looks like it just supports a single auth.
Well, Andy, do you want to handle that one?
Yeah, sure. So we support many factors of authentication. We can obviously support two-factor authentication systems like client user certs. Together with a username and password, we can support RSA Secure ID. And in fact, inside the APM Visual Policy Editor, you can configure the logon process to have up to 5 admin-defined input fields where users can enter different, you can request users to enter different information. And then what you do with that information is really up to you and your access policy. So if you want to go take some of those as a username and password and go do an authentication against Radius or Active Directory, you can do that. If you want to take the other as a phone number and look up in a directory and match that phone number, so we definitely support N-factor authentication. The Edge client has a mode where you can, for usability, it will integrate with the Control-Alt-Delete, or it'll cache credentials from the Control-Alt-Delete login process. So when a user Control-Alt-Deletes and logs into their laptop, for example, the Edge client will capture those credentials and then automatically use those to selectively start the VPN tunnel or not, depending upon what your policy says. And in that case, I can see how you might think that it only supports one factor, because we do have that mode where it will integrate with that, grab those credentials, and that's simply to make the user experience very, very seamless. So for example, on my laptop, I actually have two-factor, but I'm using that integrated mode. The second factor is a user cert. So I have a user cert that gets checked, and that username and password gets checked, and it all happens without me as a user knowing in a day-to-day use scenario.
Okay, so but the Edge client or the client for like a mobile device, an iPhone or
right, that's a great question as well. So we absolutely do support two-factor authentication for those devices as well. On the iPad and the iPhone, the iOS devices that Apple makes, the support for user certificates is really, really good, and it's natively, tightly integrated in with their platform, and we absolutely do support that method of two-factor. And they actually have a special feature called On Demand. I don't know if you're familiar with On Demand, but that makes use of the certificates. And the On Demand feature, they combine a user cert with a PIN that you're required to unlock the device. So there's something that the user knows is the PIN, and then there's something that the user has as the user certificate. And then what the On Demand feature does is that you can configure policy so that the iPhone or the iPad will automatically start a VPN session and log the user in if they're trying to access an internal resource without them having to manually start up the VPN client, log in, and then go back and access the resource. So the use case is I get an email on my device. It says, hey, Peter, go check out this link on this internal web application, and he pushes his finger on the link. And in this case, he doesn't have a VPN session started. The on-demand thing will say, oh, that's an internal link. I know that's an internal link because I've been configured that way. And I have a user cert and everything. Okay, I'll start the VPN and use the on-demand feature to start up the VPN. We can also support RSA Secure ID with the solution. The integration with things like PIN with those token types of authentication is less streamlined than a user cert, but it is possible. And for our client, you would put it in web logon mode, and then in our VPN, iOS VPN client, you'll actually just see the login page rendered for that device, and then you can then the user can then enter their PIN, their RSA PIN into there, and it's just like accessing in the web page mode. Only you're using an iOS VPN client.
Oh, okay, great.
Good questions. It's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you. And as a reminder, press *1 if you do have additional questions. Sir, I'm not showing any questions at this time.
Let's go on, I think, to the last slide. If you need any more information, of course, you can go to our website, the security section on the solution site. You can download a trial of the Local Traffic Manager Virtual Edition. And Andy, I believe you can get the trial, too, of the Access Policy Manager on that with the V.
Actually, no. So the trial, just a small correction there, the trial edition is based on a slightly older version of Big IP, and the difference between the trial edition doesn't require any interaction with anybody from F5. You can go to trial and you can self-register and get that trial edition, although it is somewhat limited in performance. What you can do, though, for a virtual edition is you can contact your local salesperson and request an eval, and you can get an SE can issue you an eval key to do an eval of the virtual edition of LTM plus APM.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing, but if you just go to the trial site, you're going to get just LTM VE that's limited in performance. Doesn't require much interaction at all with F5 to get it, though.
Hey, Andy, this is Jonathan. I have a question that I think maybe a number of audience members would be interested in. Can you talk a little bit about APM Lite and the opportunity with potentially testing APM if I'm already a Big IP customer?
Yeah, hey, that's a good question, too, and thanks for pointing that out. So what Jonathan's alluding to is that starting with version 10.1, we included a license in the base LTM product to enable up to 10 users on APM. So if you go to the provisioning tab of your Big IP LTM, you can see there under APM an option to provision APM Lite. And then once you do that, your box restarts. Then you'll see all the APM features there, and you can support up to 10 concurrent users. But otherwise, most of the features of 99.9% of the features of Access Policy Manager are there in the Lite version. It's just limited in number of users. I do have to make a little caveat there that you have to be on 1600, 3600, 39, 69, 89, 8950. One of the newer boxes that's been out since version 10. The older boxes prior to version 10. Obviously if we don't support APM on that box, then APM Lite doesn't work.
We have a lot of potential for customers who may have come to F5 and are using F5 Big IP for application delivery control and those type of services, but maybe using a separate vendor for VPN services. As you've seen in this presentation, there are a number of opportunities for you to look at access control with the Big IP just right on Big IP on top of Local Traffic Manager as an opportunity to look at access control to certain types of applications. But as your current VPN services maybe come up for refresh or extension of warranty, and you're wanting to look, or extension of maintenance and services, and you're wanting to look at other vendors maybe, consider F5 and consider consolidating to one vendor with the type of access and acceleration services and optimization that Peter has been talking about today. Any other questions?
Sir, I'm not showing any questions at this time.
All right, well, excellent. And again, thank you very much for joining this morning. Hopefully it was informative and you know a little bit more about driving identity into your network. And thanks to you, Andy and Jonathan, for joining.
Thank you for joining today's call. You may disconnect at this time. Once again, thank you for joining.